I have my Strathmore watercolor book, and I'm just beginning with clear water wash here, dropping in some water with a filbert brush. Actually, it is, let's see here, that's a mop. Nope, not a filbert, it's a mop. I lied. And it's Princeton. Select half an inch. And I'm laying down that water to commence a wet on wet technique, and this facilitates blending and blooming when you drop wet paint onto an already wetted paper surface. So I'm just mixing some cadmium red with a little bit of alizarin crimson and diluting it a fair bit with water. The paints that I'm using is a Schmincke set of 12, and on the right hand side you can see I have 4 other pans there. And in those pans there's a violet, a cerulean blue, and 2 pans from a Prima Marketing watercolor set that was called Decadent Pies. And those 2 are actually a very intense blue that acts sort of like a phthalo blue, and a green that seems to me a lot like sap. They weren't labeled, but they're very similar to other paints that I have that are named those colors. So I'm switching here to a small round brush and mixing a purple with ultramarine blue. Just sketching in the horizon line here. Now, I wouldn't recommend sketching that horizon line right next to the sky without letting it dry first. I think that's what I did here, and you can see it just sort of bled right up into the sky, and I have to go back later and sharpen it up. But here I am sketching out the tent that is in your resource photo, and I quickly decided, you know, I need to edit that out. This painting, and whenever you do your sketches, you'll just have to decide, you know, what is the focus point, what's the story here? And for me, it just wasn't about the tent, so I just erased it basically. And that's part of editing your scenes. So when you are painting your own landscape later on in this class, I want you to edit out the things that won't serve your painting, whether it's, you know, power lines or a car here or there. It just depends what your scene is about. So I'm mixing this reddish purple for the soil. I think I'm back using that mop brush. And often I leave space around the edge of the page, and my sketches just sort of float in the middle of my sketchbook page rather than go right off of the edges. Sometimes I pick one side, like here it's the bottom, and I just let the wash go right off, fall right off the bottom of the page there. Then I mixed some cadmium yellow, and I'm laying in some oranges in the sky. So I think it was a cadmium yellow with a cadmium red there to make a nice hot bright swath in the sky. I think it's right about now that I left to go fetch a smaller watercolor tin. And that one is actually a Prima Marketing tin I got on Amazon, and I took the paints out. Although they, you know, they're very intense and perfectly good quality for a lot of work, I just decided I wanted to make my own palette with tubes of paint. So that's my own little designed palette there of, I can't remember how many colors are in it. And I went and fetched it because there is an Opera Rose in that set that is just, it's a zinger. It's bright. And sometimes you just can't mix a bright enough color to match like a flower or the sky, and you just need to invest in a few of those brighter colors. So one example of this is the Opera Rose here. Another one would be a lemon yellow. You can't mix a lot of oranges and bright yellow or sunlight on highlights on things without a lemon yellow. It's a great investment. And another one I like is either a manganese blue or a cerulean blue. It's very hard to get bright, vivid sky colors with an ultramarine. I mean, again, it depends where you're living. The sky's a different color, depending on where you live. So here I'm laying in some orange dashes, just to the side of my mop brush here. Next, I mix a cerulean blue with a bit of manganese, it looks like, and I'm just laying in this background color of sky. And here the blue does bleed into the warmer colors that are already there. And if you don't want this effect, I was very happy with it. I like losing control in a lot of my sketches, but if you want it to be a bit crisper, just wait until that sky, the warm layers in the sky dry a bit more. Be more patient than I was. Yeah, it's really blooming there into the yellows and the oranges, and it is creating some slight brownish hues in there, which you may feel like avoiding. And as you might see in the resource photo, as the sky gets closer to the horizon, it gets paler, and in this image it also gets a little more yellowy. So basically it's turning, when you mix more yellow into your blue, it's turning into a light green as it gets closer to the horizon there. In general, skies are more vivid and deep the farther from the horizon they get. So the higher up in the sky, the deeper the blue, the closer to the horizon, the paler it gets. Next, I mix a dark purple to paint in the mountains here along the horizon. Again, I would recommend waiting for that sky to dry a little more so that the mountain doesn't bleed into it like I kind of got that effect. But I'm way too darn eager. When I paint, I hate waiting for things to dry. So I laid in a little bit of a purple mountain there, and then I'm mixing an even darker purple. Sometimes I make my colors darker with a Payne's Gray. It's a lovely color, blue tinted instead of just sort of a flat black. So here I am making the mountain in front a little darker. And a note on mixing purple. Well, hang on here. I want to describe that I am putting some green into the purple to draw this horizon in. But when you are mixing purples, remember you need a warm, you need a cool blue, not a warm blue. You need a cool blue like ultramarine. And you need a cool red like alizarin crimson or maybe a rose color. If you use cadmium red, you're almost never going to make a nice purple. It's going to be more brown because there's yellow in the cadmium red, and that obviously is counterproductive to making a purple. Same thing goes with a cerulean blue. It's going to be tricky to make a purple out of that, just because it's got so much yellow in it. So I'm still using I'm using a big round brush. I believe it's a 10. You can see I made a little texture mark there by laying down some color and then daubing it off with a paper towel. It's important to not just use your brushes for texture. Just go to town with whatever you have around you. Experiment. I recommend not dropping down into the tiny brush sizes. If you stay with larger brushes, you'll be surprised at the detail of the marks you can make. And it just, by using a larger brush, you lessen the chance you're going to get caught up in all the tiny details. So I've laid in some greeny, some yellow-green shrubbery there. I love that word, shrubbery. And then I've made a darker purpley green for the shadows here. I'm just sort of daubing along, making some little shrubs and desert plants here. And then I add some water to dilute it a little bit for shrubs farther in the distance. And then my cerulean is very opaque, so it's almost like adding white to what you're making. And I mixed it with some green to make a sort of sage, pale sage color. It's hard to see right now, but as it dries, it gets quite pastel-y. And in general, when we're thinking about atmosphere and atmospheric perspective, I don't know if you've heard that term before, but it just means that the atmosphere is between you and what you're looking at. So the farther away things are, the more particles of air are catching the light, and so things farther away appear more blue, more cool toned, and paler as well. So something to keep in mind. And I can always go into more detail about that in a future class. Here I went back into the sky with the ultramarine blue and the opera rose to make sort of a fuchsia-ish purple. Fuchsia-ish. It's a word. No, it's not. Fuchsia-esque. Ooh, I like that. Just still using my 10 round here. Trying to remain loose with my brush strokes. The way you hold your brush is going to make a big difference on the marks that you make. So sometimes you'll see I hold it more like a pencil to get more crispness or more accuracy, and then I try to loosen up my grip on it, hold it more like a fork, and sort of, splash the brush across. So you just do have to be aware that the different ways you hold your brush are going to make a big difference, and to practice holding it in lots of different ways. You can see in the resource photo there are these gray streaks near the horizon, and I didn't quite manage to make them as light as I would have liked. That's something that you may want to lay in a bit sooner, or perhaps use just water on your brush and lift a bit of that paint off the page in that area to make it a bit lighter. In order to do that, it still needs to be a little bit wet. You do a lot of mixing on your palette with watercolor. Unlike oils, acrylics, and even gouache, where you can do some mixing right on the painting if you'd like, with watercolor, you do really want to practice your mixing. Even though we are in this class trying to get quicker with our landscape sketching, you really don't want to cut out mixing time. This is part of the process worth doing well. You want to get your mixing right. So I'm moving back into the hot colors here. There isn't one way to build a painting in watercolor. Many say work from light to dark. Sometimes though, when you're just going out there and you want to sketch quickly, you'll end up working quite intuitively, I think. Light to dark is a good rule of thumb though. But I started with some reds, moved into the cool tones, and now I'm back in with the warm. So With this one, I sort of jumped around. So in a minute, I'm going to speed up the video just a tiny bit because the process here with this sky is a bit repetitive. But you can pause anytime to give yourself the time you need to mix and lay in the colors. I've switched, no, I'm still using the round here, and I've just kind of switched the way I'm holding the brush for those little streaks around the purple there. You may want to dab and test colors next to your painting. You'll see I do this in just a minute. Just to test the colors, and it actually makes for a really pretty sketchbook afterwards when you're flipping through and you can see all your little color test marks on the side of the painting. Making those marks along the side of the painting might also help jog your memory. If you're new to color mixing, you can sometimes, there I go on the right there, you can sometimes remember how you made certain colors if you have those little notations, those color notations along the side. A lot of time the paints are more intense than I expect them to be, and I end up having to dilute quite a lot. I mix more color than I need. So here I am making that front mountain much darker. And mixing a paler purple, testing it on the side. I believe I finally switched here to a smaller round. Yeah, I did. So that I could be slightly more accurate with that back mountain. And it's a paler purple. You can see just how little I did use a tiny brush, you know, just near the end. Sharpen up a few things. In the corner of my palette, I do have a little bit of white. Sometimes you can buy a Chinese white that comes with watercolor sets. I believe that's actually a little dab of gouache, and I'm using it to kind of make some of my colors paler. Some might call it a cheat, but personally, I don't think there are any cheats in technique. You know, there's always rules, ways to get started, but then you're allowed to start breaking them. So I'm mixing some purple and laying it into the shrubbery here as shadows, and that pretty much brings us to the end of the first step of this painting. Next, we will be going back into our sketch with some pen and ink. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're in the pen and ink stage is to be minimal. It's very easy to overdo it, and you've put so much effort into the painting itself, you don't want to go too crazy with the pen. I'm using my Lamy Safari fountain pen with a fine nib and some black Noodler's ink. This is a waterproof ink, so I can theoretically draw it on here, let it dry, and add more watercolor over top without fear of it bleeding and blending. I'm adding little textures to the foreground. Remember, you want more detail and more texture in the foreground and less as you go back into the middle ground and the background. You can certainly buy different thicknesses of nibs for these fountain pens. There's a super fine. This one's a fine, and there's also medium, and then you get into larger sizes that have a calligraphy nib. Those are a lot harder to draw with. You're going to have a lot more luck drawing with one of the nibs that has a point on the end instead of a wedge. I'm just adding tiny little touches here, dashes. One trick for adding a line when you want it to be thinner than your actual pen nib is to just make it a dashed line instead of a solid line. And another word for that is implied line. And it just makes it a little lighter since you don't have the ability to make that actual line any lighter. Making it a dashed line really helps. So I put down the pen and picked up the paintbrush again. And I'm just adding in a little more warmth in the foreground. Some reds in that soil that is just so red. It's not just the sunset that's doing this. The soil there is really actually red. This is somewhere I camped last year when I was part of a program called Land Arts of the American West. We just traveled over 6,000 miles in a van and pitched our tents at night and yeah, really got to experience the landscape. Mixing some sap green in there to enhance the ground as it recedes. Even though I did say that pen is waterproof, that ink is waterproof, I'm moving around it, and since I just laid it down, I think it is bleeding just a little bit. I don't mind that effect. I'm mixing a whole lot here to get the right hue and value for the shadows of the shrubbery. It's a green made with phthalo blue, sap green, a little bit of brown and black in there, a little bit of purple. It was truly a big mix. Adding a couple of more touches with the pen. Back and forth, picking up that brush again. This is my smaller round. And I'm using a bit of that cerulean to lay in this mountain in the far background, the farthest away from us. And this cerulean is a bit opaque, and so it makes sort of a smoky color. I really just wanted to sharpen that up because it had bled into the sky. And that brings our watercolor sketch to a close. I hope you enjoyed painting along with me and that you will visit my YouTube channel again to make some more art with me.